as the reports in Western mainstream media are covering the massive attacks on Kiev, as well as Russia's advances on the front line. So here is what Mr. Medinsky had to say on Rick Sanchez's show.
Indeed, our population, our citizens demand much harsher actions from us. It was very hard for us to go to the second round of negotiations. When Ukraine deliberately, on the day of our departure, blew up a passenger train and civilians and children died.
Is this the retaliation? What's been happening in Kiev? There's been several days now of strikes. Russia's defense ministry says they are hitting the defense infrastructure of Kiev really hard at the moment, as well as making advances on the front lines. Is this the response to the bomber attack that occurred now, what was it, a week and a half ago? Talk about what's been going on.
Well, first of all, I just like to point when words matter, and when you say missiles and bombs raining down on Kiev, that implies a lack of precision. Because when I go outside and it's raining down, the rain just landing wherever the hell it wants to land. Every Russian munition is hitting a target that's been carefully selected by the Russian Ministry of Defense to achieve specific outcomes. These are targets that have legitimate military purpose, therefore they're legitimate military target. There's nothing haphazard in what Russia is doing. I believe that what we're seeing right now is the retaliation for the train attacks, because to retaliate for the drone attack on Russian strategic bombers, Russia needs to reset the notion of strategic deterrence. The Ukraine has violated that, so has Great Britain and to some extent the United States. Sergei Lavrov in a recent statement directly implicates the British and says that American involvement is either similarly direct or through inertia, meaning that it is part of a previous policy that hasn't been brought to an end. That's what I believe is the case here. But be it as it may, the Ukrainian actions violated Russia's published nuclear doctrine in terms of a red line that would trigger a Russian nuclear response. Now, either this doctrine has meaning or it doesn't. I'm not encouraging Russia to use nuclear weapons, far from it. But the Russian retaliation has to be of a scope and scale, and that reestablishes the concept of deterrence, meaning that if you cross this red line, you will pay a price that is disproportional. In such a price that you will never want to even consider doing that again. And I believe that has yet to come. What we're seeing here is a campaign that may unfold over the course of a week or more, and it will culminate in what I believe will be a strategic strike, not of a nuclear nature, but a strategic strike on Ukraine that sends a message not just to the Ukrainians by inflicting excruciating harm on them, but to the West as well, that this will be and this will be the price that is paid in the future to your cities. Rybkov, the deputy foreign minister of Russia, recently talked about that Russia is about ready to unveil a new generation of weapons. He talked about the expiration of the INF Treaty, America withdrawing from the INF Treaty, but Russia had a moratorium on the deployment of these weapons. But because of the provocations of the West, Russia will be responding, and I believe that response will be in the form of not just Oreshnik, but I believe there's probably going to be at least one and maybe a couple more new generation intermediate range weapons. If you look back on old Soviet doctrine, and the Russians seem to be drawing upon that in the ballistic missile field in terms of their developments, projects that were underway during the Soviet Union were brought to an end because of arms control, or the end of the Soviet Union, mothballed because Russia couldn't afford it, have now been brought back to life. The Oreshnik is one such system. I believe that you'll see a follow-on system similar to a missile developed by the Russians called the Skorost back in the 1980s. The Skorost was a direct response to the Pershing II deployment into West Germany. And the purpose of the Skorost missile was if the Pershing II left its base and went to the field in an operational manner. The Skor's job was to rapidly respond and put a missile on that target instantly. And I think you're going to see the Russians fielding something, because we're talking about the potential deployment of the Dark Eagle hypersonic intermediate range system into Europe next year. Russia's going to preempt that, and we may get an operational demonstration on Ukraine. But either way, I don't think we've seen the response to the attack on the nuclear infrastructure, because that response has to reset the notion of deterrence, and Russia hasn't done that yet.
Colonel Wilkerson, would you agree with Scott's assessment, and what's your particular take on the situation?
Yes, I do. And I would add to it that in 2013 and 2014, when we were hearing from the Finns and from others who were observing Russian maneuvers inside Russia through the Center for Naval Analyses and other conduits, we heard the argument and bought the argument ourselves that precision-guided munitions had reached the stage whereby, in this case, Russia truly feared them at that time, because they, in combination, gave the equivalent of a nuclear attack. And Russia at that time felt NATO had an extraordinary advantage in terms of numbers of precision-guided munitions. These are conventional munitions, not nuclear. So I think that's a fair argument. And what Scott has just said is it's not only a fair argument, their PGM stockpile has increased majorly and gained some even new weight from technological advances and so forth. So they could make the equivalent of a small yield nuclear strike with PGMs. That's my point. My bigger point, that tactical operational point, I agree with Scott on that. My bigger point is that I think we should see now, and Donald Trump, I hope, through the opaque lens he glances at the world through on occasion, needs to see that he is absolutely indispensable to bringing this to a close. And I don't mean because he's head of the empire, but I mean because he's probably the only person, and maybe head of the empire gives him this power, to effect a higher level, if you will, end of the present relationship and beginning of a new relationship. And what I mean there is simply the relationship between Washington and Moscow, which outweighs all of this tactical operational business, no matter how much we may lament the casualties it's creating and how stupid it makes the empire look. And what Trump needs to deal with, over the head of Zelensky if necessary, over the head of his European allies if necessary, is this new relationship with Moscow. And if he has to walk with track shoes over Zelensky's head and even over Macron and Starmer and Merz's head, so be it. This needs to take precedence, and it needs to overshadow, if you will, everything else. We need a new relationship with Moscow and Washington, if for no other reason than the existential one of nuclear weapons are getting out of control.
Talk about your reaction to the U.S.'s response to all of this. This conflict it's seemingly far from over in terms of the stated promise by Donald Trump to end this conflict as soon as possible, even within 24 hours.
You know, one of the things I think that we can pick up from the clip that you just showed was that the U.S. Strategies never work against Russia because we don't understand Russia, because we create some boogeyman that this is just a dictatorship and everything is top down, that the leadership of Russia really is only one single dictator that does not respond to the people. And if you'll notice what the person who was being interviewed said, he talked about public outcry. He talked about, he seemed to imply that the government of Russia was kind of pushed into a corner. Not saying that they didn't want to respond, but they had to respond because of public outcry. Now, the strategies of the neocons are always based on an assumption that Putin runs everything, and then he's going to be emotional. Putin's angry, Putin's scared, Putin's upset. The emotions of a single individual, as opposed to a government that has to respond to the public. In fact, one of the things that you can see going on during this conflict, I think that implies that, is that the government has taken had a great concern about their economy, about ensuring that the people in Russia are not suffering economically, that their stores are not empty, et cetera, so that they don't get pushback from people suffering. So what I picked up from this particular clip, I think, was that as long as we assume that this is a dictatorship that does not respond to the public, our plans and strategies will go awry. I think that the one thing I'll add is this, that I think that what we're seeing here is also a change in tactics. I think that a lot of these strikes in Kiev, may be wrong, this is just my opinion, I think that the Ukrainians hid a lot of things, or put a lot of their strategic assets in urban areas and highly populated areas, taking advantage of the fact that the Russians were much less likely to hit targets that were in a highly populated area. I think all the strikes in Kiev shows that one of the things that they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're going to take the gloves off, and if you hide it in a highly populated area, we're going to hit it anyway and let the chips fall where they may. So that's just a couple of things that I thought.
Scott, you made a great point earlier about how this is all a reaction, especially to the the passenger train attacks, which actually Mr. Brzezinski mentioned later in the interview. So some have surmised that this war, this conflict, or shall we say special military operation, as Russia calls it, is moving into a counter-terror operation. Do you agree with that? And what would be the implications?
There's political aspects to that and military aspects to that. Politically, I think it's already a counter-terrorist operation because the Russian government has labeled Zelensky and the Zelensky government as a terrorist organization, a terrorist entity, as terrorists themselves. When you have Vladimir Putin making that comment, that is declaratory policy. And I think the political implications of that are quite clear, and we've seen them manifested in the Russian presentation in Istanbul, where the Russians have laid out in their conditions for conflict termination a new election that replaces the president, replaces the parliament with something that manifests the will of the Ukrainian people. And only with this newly elected entity can Russia finally conclude peace. And that is a reflection of the fact that Russia views the Ukrainian government as it currently exists as a terrorist entity. So I think politically that decision has been made. Militarily, no, I don't think Russia is going to transition from a special military operation that has very specific goals and objectives to a counter-terrorist operation, which is a completely different ball game from a military standpoint. The objectives would be different, etc. Russia's in the business right now of demilitarizing Ukraine. That's not a counter-terrorist operation objective. This is standard. We're going to kick your ass 3 ways from Sunday. And that's what Russia's doing. They are demilitarizing the old school way. That's closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower, but never shoving a bayonet, except they don't do bayonets anymore, putting a drone up their ass and blowing them up. And Russia is dominating the battlefield in ways that are beyond the imagination and comprehension of people here in the United States. And Russia's not going to do anything to change that. Denazification is a political objective, but denazification is just another fancy way of talking about anti-terrorism. Because how do you deal with the Nazis? It's the same we deal with the terrorists. You delegitimize them. You write them out of the Constitution. You take them out of the government. So that's already happening. But I don't see the Russian military suddenly waking up and declaring a global war on terror. I think the Russian military is doing what it's doing. What you may see down the future is that this will transition from a special military operation into a state of war, especially if Ukraine is unwilling to make the political transitions that Russia is demanding. If the Ukrainian government continues to insist on existing in its current manifestation, then Russia will have to go to war against this government. It's also, when we speak of setting deterrence, I think in Russia at some point in time, one of the ways to deter Western engagement is that I believe Europe and NATO and the European Union, even the United States, have exploited this unique thing called a special military operation, which is war, but not war. I mean, what war do you get to ride a train from the Polish border into Kiev willy-nilly all the time? No war that I've ever been aware of. If I were doing targeting, that train line would have been taken out on day one. But there are many examples of this, the inconsistencies of targeting, or I would say that just the different approaches that the West has exploited. I think we will see Russia transition to a war and the targeting will be different, and their approach towards Western engagement will become different too. There are potential outcomes there that will be very serious, especially if Europe continues to indicate that it's going to continue to pour resources into Ukraine. That's something that Russia cannot allow to happen. Let's just be honest. Russia right now has the military capacity on hand in the theater to expand this conflict to the Dnieper River, maybe recapture Kherson, move into Mykolaiv, and stabilize Kharkov and Sumy, and recapture Donetsk. But Russia doesn't have the capacity right now to take Odessa. That would require additional hundreds of thousands of troops to be mobilized. Russia doesn't have the capacity to take all of Sumy, all of Chernihiv. It would require additional resources. And to get to those additional resources, Russia would have to enter into a new phase of the conflict, one which I believe would have to be manifested as a state of war. So I think we're going to have to get to that point. It doesn't mean that Russia is losing. It just means that a Russian victory now is going to have to be redefined as a total victory against Ukraine, not this special military operation.
Scott mentioned that Russia is indeed kicking the behind of Ukraine on the battlefield, but I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you've gotten these comments. Many people are very skeptical about this. What do you say to those right now who are doubtful about Russia's capabilities to put this conflict to an end? Because when the bomber attack happened, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm on the part, especially of the pro-Ukrainian side, that this was somehow turning the table.
Going back to what Scott just said, I go back to my Clausewitz and talk about the dynamics of warfare and how warfare changes miraculously almost. It can transform itself in midstream, as it were, and be an entirely different war, an entirely different thing that was contemplated when the first bullet went down range. And I see the prospect for that here looming greatly. And I would just take a little bit of exception with what Scott said with regard to Odessa and perhaps further gains by Russia. Should we have, and I think there is the possibility for, a sudden and complete collapse of Ukraine. I'm talking about real chaos. I'm talking about people actually turning their backs and running. We used to call it in traditional combat the exploitation. That's where you kill more of the enemy than you ever did in the months preceding that maneuver. And you kill them because you're shooting and running forward, and they're shooting, if they are at all, and running backwards. So you're shooting them in the back. Now, that's just a description of a traditional battlefield where exploitation is being executed. But I think what we're seeing here is the possibility of that. The entire Ukrainian front, as it were, collapsing in almost a moment, and Russia in a moment of surprise suddenly realizing it has more opportunity than it thought it had in a conventional sense. And do they exploit that? And that's the term usually used with it. Do they exploit that, or do they just stop there and say, no, we've gained what we wanted to gain, maybe a little adjustment here, adjustment there, and we'll just hold what we've got? We are pregnant with that kind of possibility, I think, now, because the Ukrainians are losing so dramatically. And if you want to do away with these arguments that are being thrown out there by everyone from Lindsey Graham to Starmer to Mertz, that Ukraine is still on the qui vive, can still fight, can still hold on and everything quickly and dramatically, that would do it. That's a dangerous moment. It's a very dangerous moment. And one reason why I think, as I said before, we need to get some really serious effort going on here to stop this before we reach that point and give both sides a real dilemma. Ukraine a dilemma from the point of view, it's over, dude. It's over, and you have lost dramatically. And Russia, wow, we have won, and we've won in a way we never dreamed we would have won. And now how do we deal with it? How do we deal with it? We do not want all of Ukraine. Please, don't want all of Ukraine. But there it is. There it is.
I tend to think, I've thought for a while similar to what Colonel Wilkerson said, and that is that what Russia's doing is they're chipping away at the capabilities of Ukraine, and that when it falls, it all falls at one time. So they wouldn't have to, certainly, I agree with Scott, if they had to fight their way into Odessa and into these large cities of 1 million and 2 million people and take them individually, I mean, that is, cost prohibitive as far as the amount of people that you would lose and equipment it would take, et cetera. But I think that if they continue to batter away at the capabilities of Ukraine, that either a political collapse or a military collapse, either one of them will have the same effect. I mean, if there is a political collapse, then certainly you've got people fighting on the front lines, looking over their shoulders saying, where are the orders coming from? Where's more stuff coming from? What do we do? What are we fighting for? So a political or a military collapse, I think, would give you the same outcome, which would mean a city such as Odessa, et cetera, will then becomes virtually undefended because you don't have a real military there saying we're going to be resupplied, we're going to have more people. They're just sitting there saying, what are we doing? We're calling headquarters and nobody's answering the phone. And I think that's where we get to. I think at that point you have two things. You have, number one, Russia has to decide, what do we want to do? How far do we want to go? And what do we want to take on our balance sheets? How much of this do we want to have to feed people and fix? And that's one thing. I think the other thing is a crisis point for NATO, because people are going to be screaming at Trump, you got to do something. The Russians are breaking through. But the question is going to be, and what are our options? We don't have 500,000 people to throw at the road. We don't have the resources to go in there if we wanted to go to the Russian border and probably still get bashed to hell if we did it. So there will be a crisis point, I think. And I think that's kind of what we're kind of hovering around, is that crisis point, recognizing that the weight of the Russian army leaning on the Ukrainians and NATO's capabilities are going to come to a head at some point. And when they do, then where are we?
First of all, I have just to point out that anytime I enter a conversation where somebody uses the term qui vive, I quit, because it's a level of intellect, and that's an Army term. I mean, Marine Corps was like qui vive. It means who lives. It's a great term. I've just been chuckling ever since the Colonel used it, because I thank you, sir, for injecting that kind of intellectual capacity.
General order number one.
Yeah, who lives? Who goes there? But look, I agree on the concept of collapse. Here's my thing with the Russians. The Russians have not shown a tendency to engage in the kind of classic big arrow exploitation warfare. And two, we have the British, who are very heavily advising the Ukrainian forces right now on how to extend this conflict. And I think what we're going to get very soon is a point where the Ukrainians are going to withdraw to the Dnieper River line. And if they can withdraw to the Dnieper River line in a modicum of order, they could create a physical barrier that would be very difficult for the Russians to exploit rapidly. And then if they can settle behind that, anchored on Odessa in the south, Kiev in the north, and maybe Dnipropetrovsk in the center, that's where Russia would need more troops if they were going to do that. The other thing is, I think the Russians are concerned about a rapid exploitation. To manage the collapse is another thing that the Russians are concerned about. And this is why the Russians are putting such an emphasis on trying to achieve a modicum of political stability in Ukraine, because one of the great problems that will be presented to the Russians is, war is an extension of politics by other means. Had to do that to you, Colonel. With
an admixture of violence.
I love the violent part, but my academic advisors would always tell me never forget that life isn't only lived in the trenches. But this is a conflict that's being waged economically against Ukraine, and very effectively so. We just saw that Ukraine defaulted on its payments. Ukraine is literally bankrupt as we speak. It's being fought socially Well, we'll go back to the economy. From an industrial standpoint, in power generation standpoint, Ukraine's economic infrastructure is likewise collapsing right now. And with the collapse of the economy comes the collapse of social sustainment. You'll see societal collapse where the people collectively lose faith in the government, which brings about political collapse. And ideally, if you're trying to collapse a society, you're putting pressure on all four fronts. But if you get the total collapse, it creates a vacuum, and that creates uncertainty. And the one thing that, speaking to Russian generals and Russian politicians, not politicians so much, but diplomats about this, the Russians want predictability. The big term that the Russians always use is we prefer predictability. It helps us as we put forward plans. And when you have collapse in a vacuum, the chaos is the most unpredictable thing out there. And so I don't think the Russians are in the chaos generation mode. I think the Russians are in the controlled collapse mode, meaning that you want to create pressures that will compel the Ukrainians to be more acceptable of outcomes that are desired by the Russians. But when you have the collapse, you create potential that is unpredictable and could be detrimental. And so I don't know if the Russians want to go into the exploitation phase, because that brings with it the potential of political collapse. And what happens if you have political collapse and you're not ready to? What happens if the political collapse creates uncertainty in Western Ukraine, and suddenly Kiev collapses and Lvov says, we're the new Western Ukrainian, a new entity. We're creating our own Western Ukrainian state. The Poles and the Ukrainians have discussed this. Zelensky has spoken with the Polish president in the past about creating a potential Western Ukrainian state that is joined up with the Poles politically and economically. So if you have a collapse in Kiev and you don't have anything to replace it to assume control over the totality of Ukraine, you now have a Western Ukrainian entity where Polish troops now come in and declare this to be similar to what Russia did with the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, where suddenly these entities, these separatist entities, declared independence. Russia recognized the independence and then created a collective security arrangement with them. Poland could easily do that in the Western Ukraine. They could do it unilaterally, and they would have every right to do it if you have collapse, because Poland has to look out for its own national security interests. So it needs to bring stability to its eastern frontiers. Russia doesn't want that to happen. It doesn't want the same thing to happen in other parts of Ukraine. So I think Russia is looking for more of a soft landing as opposed to a hard crash, which means this has to be managed very carefully, which is why we come back to the special military operation. One of the reasons why this is a special military operation is there's a heavy political component to this conflict to avoid what we normally want in a war. I mean, Colonel Wilkerson, you remember in the Gulf War, when Operation Desert Storm started, I remember when I opened up the op order, they broke it out of its sealed package and boom, opened it up. Very first thing that identified the goal and objective was, of course, the liberation of Kuwait. But to achieve this, we were to destroy the Republican Guard, which was the center of gravity for the sustained survival of the Saddam government. So we were going to bring down the Saddam government. That was written right there in the op order for Operation Desert Storm. And my God, we tried to do that. We got to the point where we had the Republican Guard surrounded, and we could have killed them. Give us 36 to 48 more hours, and there would have been 30,000 more dead Iraqi guardsmen, and the Saddam government would have collapsed. But then suddenly people woke up to, well, wait a minute. If Saddam collapses, we got 1.5 million Iranians mobilized on the border. What happens if they start making a move in? What happens if Kurdistan I should say going south, even though it's in the north, but if Kurdistan goes wild and the Iranians move in there, what happens if suddenly we have the Iranians make a power move into the chaos here? Are we prepared to do that? And the answer was no. Even though we had all these troops there, we had not prepared for the potential of a sustained follow-on conflict with the Iranians. And so that's why we stopped killing Republican guardsmen and started creating the conditions for the stability and survivability of the Saddam regime, the exact opposite of what we planned for at the beginning of this conflict. I think the Russians are smarter than this. The Russians understand that they have to manage this conflict to avoid total collapse, because the vacuum that's created is unpredictable. And I just come back to the Russians love predictability.
And I would just come back to the fact that Clausewitz's greatest enemy, defined as the friction of war, is
Friction of war, yeah. Once
and
again,
you just described a great example of with your alternative government scenario, a great example of what could happen, actually could happen. And there are other scenarios you could describe too that would involve Poland.